The dusty street froze when Jard shouted, "Let her go." A poor cowboy with nothing to his name, yet in that moment he stood like a storm, because that woman, dragged through the dirt and pain, had a fire in her eyes that begged him to save her, and he knew he would, even if it cost him his life. The dusty wind rolled across the open plains as the sun dipped low over the line of wooden storefronts, brushing them in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of evening when horses grew restless, shadows lengthened slow and careful, and the small frontier town of Willow Bend seemed to hold its breath. People spoke in murmurs, doors opened only halfway, and a strange stillness crept through the street, an unease, like everyone sensed something was about to break. Jard Cole, a lean cowboy with a torn hat and tired boots, was leading his old mare down the road when he heard the commotion. At first it was only the clatter of hooves, distant and indistinct, but then a scream sliced through the silence, a woman's scream, raw and terrified. Jard froze. His fingers tightened around the reins. Something inside him twisted. Down the street, a cart dragged wildly behind two riders, and clinging to a rope tied cruelly to the rear axle was a woman, a young woman with long dark hair whipping behind her as she stumbled, fell, got pulled up again, and stumbled once more. Her dress was torn, dust-covered, her arms scraped red. She cried out again, and that cry struck Jard like a bullet. Without thinking, he threw himself onto his mare and kicked hard. The mare launched into a gallop, her hooves pounding like thunder. The bystanders only stared, no one else moved. Fear kept their hands frozen by their sides, but Jard had never been a man to stand still while someone suffered. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice deep and carrying across the street. The two riders didn't slow. One turned slightly, giving Jard a mocking grin. They urged the horses faster, dragging the helpless woman even more violently across the dirt road. She looked up at Jard, only for a second, only long enough for him to see her eyes. They were wide, shimmering with pain and fear, but beneath all that there was something else. Strength, defiance, a silent plea. And in that single moment, Jard felt something shift inside him. He kicked harder, his mare surged forward. The distance closed 10 yards, then 5. Jard leaned down, reached, stretched out his arm and seized the rope with a brutal yank. The cart jerked sideways. One of the riders lost balance and fell, rolling across the ground. The other cursed loudly and jerked his reins, trying to regain control. Jard swung down from the saddle before the mare had even fully stopped. He pulled his knife from his belt and cut the rope. The woman crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. He knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You hear me, you're safe." Her eyes fluttered open. She stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but no sound escaped. Behind them, the fallen rider scrambled up, furious, and reached for his gun. Jard spun, shielding the woman with his body, but before anything could escalate, Sheriff Holloran's voice boomed across the street. "That's enough, drop your weapon." The rider froze. The sheriff's deputies closed in, and within moments, the two men were disarmed and restrained. The townspeople finally stepped out of the shadows, whispering among themselves, staring at Jard and the woman as though trying to understand what had just happened. The woman was still shaking. Jard turned back to her gently. "Ma'am, can you stand?" I think so," she whispered. He helped her up carefully, as though she were made of glass. Her legs wobbled, and she leaned against him for balance. He felt the warmth of her against his chest, the fragile tremble of her breath, and his heart wrenched. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eva," she said weakly, "Eva Marin." "That's a pretty name," he said without thinking. She looked up at him, and despite everything, despite the dust on her skin, the tears still drying on her cheeks, she gave him the smallest, softest smile, a smile that hit him harder than any blow. Jard helped her into the sheriff's office, where she was given water, a chair, and blankets. The sheriff questioned her gently, but her voice broke several times. Jard stayed near the doorway, watching, listening, unable to pull himself away. Eva told them she had been traveling from her family's homestead when the riders ambushed her. She had fought back, of course she had, but they overpowered her, tore her from her wagon, and dragged her into town for reasons she didn't understand. When the questioning ended, Jard stepped closer. "You have someplace to go?" he asked quietly. Eva looked down at her hands. "My wagon's ruined. My horse ran off during the attack. I don't know what I'm going to do." Jard didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "You can stay at the boarding house," he said. "I'll help pay for your room till you figure things out." Her eyes lifted slowly. "You barely know me." He shrugged. "You needed help, that's all I need to know." Her gaze softened. She was exhausted, shaken, but there was gratitude in her eyes, warm, glowing gratitude that made something deep in Jard's chest stir. Over the next few days, Eva recovered. She walked with a limp, her arms bruised and scraped, but she grew stronger. And Jard found himself stopping by the boarding house every morning to check on her, first out of concern, then out of habit, then simply because he wanted to see her. They talked for hours. She told him about her life on the homestead, about the small garden she loved tending, about the wildflowers she liked to gather in spring. He told her about his work at the cattle ranches, about the long days driving herds, about the quiet nights camping under the stars. Eva listened with bright curiosity. Jard listened with quiet admiration. And somewhere between those conversations, something gentle and unexpected began to grow. One afternoon, when the sun was warm and soft, Eva asked if he would take her on a walk through the meadows outside town. Her limp had improved, and she said she wanted to feel the wind again, to see something beautiful after everything that had happened. Jard agreed instantly. They walked side by side along a narrow dirt trail. Eva's dress fluttered lightly around her ankles, and her hair, though still a bit tangled from recent days, glistened in the sunlight. Jard tried not to stare too much, but he failed more often than he succeeded. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For rescuing me, for checking on me, for staying near even when you didn't have to." He stopped walking. She turned to face him. Her eyes were deep and quiet, like a lake before dawn. "You never had to repay me," Jard said. "I did what anyone should have done." "But no one else did," she replied gently. "Only you." He swallowed, unable to speak. Eva stepped closer, just a small step, but enough to make his breath catch. "You made me feel safe," she whispered. Those words shook him, because in all his wandering years, in all the fences he'd mended, storms he'd ridden through, miles he'd crossed, no one had ever spoken to him like that, as though he mattered not just for what he did, but for who he was. He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. She didn't pull away. She looked at him with an openness so pure it made his chest ache. "I'd do it again," he said softly, 1,000 times. She closed her eyes and let out a trembling breath. And in that small moment, the world seemed to pause around them, the wind quieting, the grass stilling, everything waiting. But before either of them could move closer, a gunshot cracked through the distance. Eva gasped. Jard spun, hand on his belt, ready to draw, but he didn't have his gun. Sheriff's orders. The men who attacked Eva had escaped from their holding the night before, and the sheriff had been urging everyone to stay alert. Jard grabbed Eva's hand. "Get down." They dove behind a cluster of boulders. Eva trembled as another gunshot rang out. "They're here," Jard muttered. "They followed us." Eva's grip tightened around his fingers. "Why?" "Because cowards don't like being stopped," he said grimly. The riders, 3 of them this time, appeared from behind the ridge. Their faces were filled with fury. Jard pressed Eva back, shielding her. He looked around. No weapon, no cover except the rocks, no help in sight. "Jard," Eva whispered, voice quivering, "I'm scared." He cupped her face with both hands, forcing her eyes to meet his. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, with absolute conviction. "Not while I'm breathing." A thundering of hooves broke through the air. Jard turned just in time to see Sheriff Holleran and 2 deputies charging toward them from the opposite side. The riders cursed. A chase broke out. Gunfire echoed. horses reared, dust filled the sky. Jard kept Eva close, covering her ears, trying to shield her from the violence. When the chaos finally died down, the sheriff approached with an exhausted shake of his head. "They won't bother anyone again," he said. Eva exhaled in relief and leaned against Jard. He held her tightly, heart pounding, as he realized how close he'd come to losing her, someone who only days ago had been a stranger. As they walked back into town, Eva limping slightly, Jard supporting her, the sheriff rode beside them. "You've done more than enough, Jard," the sheriff said. "You saved her twice now." Jard glanced at Eva, who was looking at him with those same soft eyes. "I didn't save her," he said. "She's stronger than anyone realizes." Eva smiled at him, warmth blooming across her face. Over the next weeks, Willow Bend returned to normal, but for Jard and Eva, nothing was the same. They spent more time together, sometimes talking, other times simply sitting near each other in peaceful silence. Jard fixed things around the boarding house for her. Eva mended his shirts. They shared meals, walked along the riverbanks, watched the sun set over the plains. Slowly, gently, they began to rely on each other. One evening, Eva knocked on Jard's door. She stood there with her hands clasped tightly before her, eyes uncertain. "Jard, can we talk?" "Of course." He stepped aside, and she entered. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to go back to my homestead," she said quietly, "but I can't do it alone." He swallowed. "You want me to come with you?" She nodded. "Just to help me settle, just until I'm sure I'm safe." Jard hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because her words stirred something deep inside him. He had never stayed in one place long, never made promises, but Eva wasn't just another person passing through his life. She was becoming something far more important. "I'll take you," he said, "and I'll stay as long as you need." Eva looked relieved, no, more than relieved. She looked grateful in a way that made Jard's heart swell. They set out 2 days later. The journey was calm. They camped under a sky spilling stars, and Eva told stories of her childhood, stories about her mother teaching her how to braid hair, her father teaching her how to ride, her brother carving wooden toys for her when she was little. Jard listened, his eyes lingering on her more often than he realized. When they reached the homestead, Eva's breath caught. The place was damaged from the attack, shattered windows, a broken fence, debris scattered everywhere. Her eyes filled with tears. Jard stepped behind her and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "We'll fix it," he said, "all of it." For the next days they worked side by side. Jard repaired the fencing. Eva cleaned and rebuilt the garden. Together they restored the broken door. Day by day, the homestead began to breathe again. One afternoon, when the work was nearly done, Eva stood in the doorway, watching Jard hammer the final plank into place. Her expression was unreadable, soft, thoughtful. When he turned to her, she stepped closer. "Jard." "Yes." "You said you'd stay as long as I needed." She paused, voice trembling slightly. "What if I need you longer, much longer?" He blinked, heartbeat quickening. "How long is longer?" Her hands lifted slowly, hesitantly, and brushed his chest. "As long as you'll stay," she whispered. That broke something inside him, something he hadn't known was locked away. Jard reached out, took her hands, and held them between his. "Eva," he murmured, voice rough, "I'm not good with promises. I've spent my life moving from one place to the next, but with you, I don't want to leave." She stepped closer, so close their foreheads almost touched. "Then don't," she breathed. Jard cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. She leaned into his touch, eyes glimmering with affection, trust, and something deeper, something that made the earth beneath him feel unsteady. He lowered his forehead to hers, closing the last inch of space between them. "I'll stay," he whispered, "as long as you'll have me." Eva's breath trembled softly against his skin. "And I'll have you," she said, "for as long as you'll stay." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Willow Bend, Jard realized he had finally found something he'd never known he needed, someone to come home to. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet mornings, shared chores, laughter drifting across the fields, and evenings spent side by side watching the sun melt into the horizon. Eva's limp faded. Jard repaired the barn. They planted new flowers around the porch, their colors bright and full of life. And somewhere in those ordinary days, their hearts intertwined completely. One night, Eva sat beside Jard on the front steps of the homestead, wrapped in a shawl he'd fixed for her. The wind carried the scent of blooming sage. The moon cast silver across their faces. "Jard," she said softly. He looked at her. "Do you ever wonder," she murmured, "why you were there that day in that moment when I needed someone the most?" He smiled gently. "Maybe I was just lucky." "No," she whispered. "I think it was meant. I think you were meant to find me." He didn't answer right away. He only reached out, took her hand, and held it with a tenderness that said everything words couldn't. Eva leaned against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. "I'm glad I found you," he murmured. She closed her eyes. "I'm glad you stayed." Jard's thumb traced slow, steady circles across the back of her hand. The stars glittered overhead. The world went quiet, except for the heartbeat of two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected way. Eva lifted her head slightly and looked at him, really looked at him. Her eyes were soft and warm, full of love so deep it made Jard's breath catch. Without hesitation, without fear, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was gentle at first, a soft brush of lips, a trembling exchange of breath. Then it deepened, filled with all the feelings they hadn't spoken aloud but had been growing between them since the moment Jard pulled her from the dust. When they parted, she kept her forehead pressed against his. "I love you," she whispered. Jard's heart stuttered. He wasn't a man who spoke easily, not about feelings, not about fears, not about dreams. But Eva had unlocked something in him he didn't know existed. He lifted her chin, looking into her eyes as though seeing his future reflected there. "I love you too," he said quietly, but with a certainty that shook them both. Eva let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, full of relief and joy. Jard pulled her fully into his arms. She curled against him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as though afraid he might disappear. But he held her firmly, protectively, lovingly. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered into her hair. And he meant it with everything inside him. Under the vast, star-streaked sky of the frontier, with the scent of sage drifting through the air and the warmth of her hand in his, Jard knew this was where his wandering life ended, and where something beautiful, tender, and everlasting began. The man who had once drifted from place to place without purpose had now found one in the eyes of a woman he had rescued from the dust. And Eva, who had once feared she would lose everything, discovered that love could bloom even in the aftermath of terror, strong, bright, unbreakable. Together they built a life, a simple one, a quiet one, but the kind that made every sunrise sweeter and every night calmer. Because love, real love, wasn't in the dazzling moments or the grand gestures. It was in the gentle touches, the shared glances, the whispered promises, and the unspoken truth that they were each other's home. And as the wind carried their laughter across the plains, Jard and Eva began a new story, one shaped by courage, healing, and a bond forged the moment a cowboy warned two riders to let a woman go. A bond that would last them a lifetime.